Hey, let's talk about games.
Good afternoon, my friends. Good morning. Welcome back. Nice to see you again. Talking about Martyr today, specifically talking about predictions regarding the Warzone meta for the classes of Inquisitor Martyr. That's right, the Warzone's going to be out today, tomorrow, some point soon. Please don't quote me. This is only an estimate that I've seen on the forums, but it'll be out any moment now. So the question is, what are you guys going to be rocking for it? And first up, I will say I'd love to know down below if you've got some ideas other than what I'm throwing at you as to what you think is going to work. Please throw that toward me. Now, guys, what I'm going to show you to begin with is just my preferences on what I think is going to be strong, and this will apply to many different builds, and it will be a philosophy you can take hopefully into your own build. So first up, we're going to look at the critical hit tree because in my view it's one of the best trees within the game. Not only do you have just a nice amount of critical hit percentage within this, you've also got Red Thirst, which apparently does work currently. It doesn't always have a debuff marker, so you don't always know if it is, but it should be stacking up your damage. Now obviously on harder difficulties, if you're taking 10, 20, 30 seconds to kill something, this is never going to get you that much damage. But it can be exceptionally useful if you've just killed a pack of Nurglings per se. You're going to get yourself 100% bonus damage for 10 seconds. So that can be a real game changer in how much damage you're going to be doing. It's something I really recommend. Now, the other reason that this tree is so strong, combining all of this critical strength, which is lovely jubbly, combining all of this extra critical hit chance that you're going to pick up, with something like an inoculator that has some extra critical hit chance, with some gear with some extra critical hit and digital weapons per se, maybe, what you're going to end up with is a very easy 100% guaranteed critical hit all the damn time. Then you compare that with something like Berserker Rage, which is going to give you 1% of your health for every crit you get. Combine that with something like an AoE or a rapid fire weapon, you've got a really good healing stream there, as well as some pretty persistent damage. And believe me, when you're going for the higher difficulties, you're going to be taking a lot more damage. Getting some mitigation in there, getting some healing rather, sustain, is going to be of some use. Now obviously hitting 5, 8 enemies at once with an AoE, it's going to get you 10% of your health. It's not earth-shatteringly amazing, but it is useful, and it is helpful for keeping your character going and ploughing on through the missions. But above all, it's just a really consistent way to boost your damage up and make this into something a little bit more useful. Now the next up is a tree I find somewhat controversial because it's a tree where the middle, the centre of it, is the sort of holy grail for many people that want additional cooldown. Yes, it does give you a lovely 8% cooldown when you get a kill, 4% when you deal damage, so hit yourself 10 enemies at once. Damn, that's a lot of cooldown. However, I do have some reservations with this. First up, when you're on a high difficulty, you're not going to be getting as many kills per second, so it's not going to be as beneficial or as noticeable. The other thing I have a slight bit of concern with is there's quite a few what I'd call semi-redundant points over here. We've got a lot of suppression resist. Obviously no one's going to pick up 20% bonus damage to mind skills, not unless they're absolutely drunk, but there are some bonuses to melee. The area of effect is fairly useful to pick up, but overall I think there's about probably 8 skills you'll be picking up in here if you want to chase the central one, which aren't going to be doing anything for you. And while I think that this is still a good tree for those of you that really want the extra cooldown, I think the actual better option here is cerebral feedback. Now obviously there will be builds where you want both. If you want to make a lightning hammer into something like a pogo stick, turn that 6 seconds down into like a 1.5 or 2, you're going to need this as well as the area effect tree. And if your goal is just having loads of cooldown, obviously the area effect will be helpful for that. But cerebral feedback on its own does a pretty good job, especially when you come to rapid fire weapons. So if you want to be using your armor ability more often, your digital weapons, simply use this alongside a critical hit tree and it will be sufficient to lower the cooldown quite a lot. If you're rocking a slow single fire weapon, oh well, that's not really going to synergize as well, but it's still going to give you occasional and infrequent cooldown. For me, only having to spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points is exceptionally useful, and the other ones here invested aren't too bad. There's an extra 9% here for skills longer than 1 second, so that on its own is fairly useful. And also having the mobility skills resetting when you're low on health, very useful, and another 10% for all skills longer than 1 second. So if your goal is cooldown, I think actually spending these 6 points exceptionally good. And in the Psychic tree and the Assassin tree, then just going 2 more points up here is just such a strong spend. For the Psyker, it's going to lower your cooldowns via using weapon abilities, just exceptionally good. Even for the Crusader, I think this is a great option for any weapon. Now, moving on from here, if you're wanting to go for the slower rate of fire weapons, I think you're going to have yourself a pretty hard time. It may be doable, but here's why I think it's going to be a little bit rough. When you raise up the damage, so you're taking 400% extra damage, killing enemies before they kill you becomes almost a priority, and if you are going for a single fire weapon, what you will normally end up doing is A, having to use a cover system, or B, having to try and get a lot of sustain, and or even C, kiting like a mofo, and probably it's going to end up being a combination of the latter two. Cover will probably still die fairly quick. You might find the occasional piece that keeps you alive for a little bit, but eventually it's going to come to the point where you're just kiting enemies. Now, at this point, the sustain for this build, I would say, is best to come from euphoric glands. There are other options, but this is simply one of the best. Every one hit kill restores 10% of max HP. What it should say is every time you get a kill with a single target skill, you'll get 10% of your life back. So even if it's a low damage weapon like an autogun, this is really, really good. It's going to give you loads of sustain. 10% of your health is quite a lot, especially if you're something like a Crusader. That is 400 health, potentially even more, and then you can take advantage of some other skills and abilities down in the hit point tree to have that healing converted to give you some extra suppression points. So for every kill you would get 400 health and 40 suppression. So really, it's not a bad option. It will give you some sustain, but I will say now, from what I've seen of the game thus far, you do tend to take a lot more damage if you're not going down the AoE route. And on that note, let's talk a little bit about the weapon general balance, because one thing I've touched on here that I want to get out in the open is that simply for me, AoE is currently pretty damn king. If we bring up our inventory over here and we look at some of the single target abilities like the melter gun, let's look at the actual damage here, not the DPS but the damage. We've got 200 and something, we've got 170, we'll call that 280, and then we've got a channeled, which is quite hard to read. If you compare that with an AoE ability, it's 220. It's not considerably lower. If we go down to the needle rifle down here, 151, puts a dot on them too, which is probably why it's a little bit lower. Let's see what others we have here. We've got a plasma gun, single target, yep, single target, yep, and AoE, this is doing 109, but it is a compressed charge shot, so it ends up doing quite a lot anyway. What you will find as a general rule of thumb within this game is that the AoE abilities do pretty damn good damage. Take, for example, the power sword down here. Single target, looking pretty good. AoE, not much worse. Tiny little bit, does have a bonus to critical strike on it, mind you, so does the single, but still very, very good. The speed in which you can kill stuff with an AoE for me really reduces the amount of damage you're going to take, and taking the time to kill one enemy at a time, even with a 20 or 30% bonus damage, means you're going to be taking a lot more damage because it's going to take a lot longer to kill stuff. So it's just something to be aware of, that within this game, I really do think having only single target abilities is really going to hurt yourself. Perhaps there's a couple of exceptions, something like the melter gun, which, because its abilities are off of the global cooldown, you can bash. Yes, you'll overheat very quickly, but you can use it to rinse through enemies a little bit quicker. But if you're using something that really is just a single target slog, a little bit like a hotshot las rifle, I'm not entirely sure that that's going to be the most enjoyable experience, let's say. Going back to the skill trees, there are obviously some other good choices here too. Heat attacks is perfectly adequate for boosting your heat weapons. Physical attacks, obviously very good too. Both of these have the ability to put a vulnerability on with a critical hit, and this is one of the other mechanics within the game that I think is almost essential for every build. When you get to a point where you're taking a long time to kill enemies, having a high critical hit chance and applying a vulnerability with every hit means you will increase your damage with every hit, which is just going to make your life a lot less painful, especially if it's an auto or a full auto weapon, a high rate of fire. If you've got a 100% critical hit on an auto gun, after about 1.8 seconds of DACA, they're taking double damage. Now granted, if they're armoured, they're still going to take ages to kill, but it's a very quick way of getting your damage up quickly. And both in this tree And in this tree, where are you? Where are you? You're here somewhere. There you go. Very, very useful. And for the melee users out there, only got to spend 3 points over here for exposed weakness, which again does the same thing, vulnerability based on critical hit. For me, one of the more essential mechanics in the game to make the elite battles a little bit quicker and a little bit less painful. It's probably not mandatory, but I do find it very, very effective. Now next you're wondering, well, okay, maybe I don't want to go for a melee build and use some of these points down here, go for sustain. Maybe I want to actually be a range build. Oh, someone followed me, lovely jubbly. So what could we do to make a range build a little bit better? Well, the debuff tree is of something that can also work very, very well with the critical hit side of things, at least with the assassin. For the psyker, it also gives you a little bit of a bonus. I would suggest it as well if you're rocking a high debuff. If you've got a lot of armor piercing, armor breaking, you could pick up a very easy 12% extra damage here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very, very useful. 50% suppression damage bonus for the ability can be useful, especially when you combine it with the critical hit plus 50% suppression damage bonus too, 100% suppression damage bonus, meaning, well, until you get to the really high difficulty, you have a chance of CCing something. Now here's where I rock the boat a little bit. I find most of the time the issue when the difficulty is raised in this game, when you're going for plus 500, plus 600 difficulty, the issue tends to not come with how much damage you're dealing, it's how much damage you're taking, which is why I'm actually prepared to make some adjustments to the builds to try and actually make this a little bit more achievable. So for the assassin, I'm going to be having a look into the defense tree and keeping an eye on it as well as the hit point tree for some very good pickups down here. So for the hit point tree, having the extra suppression point regen from the dodge mechanic, really, really useful, guys. If you're not going for a dodged base assassin, I do think you're going to reach a point where the damage you take simply go way out, it sort of exceeds what you can possibly heal per second. Maybe with one exception where you could go for the enchanted weapon where you have a 20% chance to heal for double damage. Hopefully you guys know the one I mean. You deal double damage or have a 20% chance to, and you heal for that amount. You could maybe use that without deflect, but then you'll probably need to go into mitigation just so you're not dying in a couple of seconds, or maybe even get crisis management so you're not just losing your health in a couple of seconds. Keep an eye out for this one. Vascular pumps, exceptionally useful. Anything else that's going to give you healing based on suppression regen and healing based on suppression regen, sorry, other way around, you guys know what I mean. Exceptionally useful if you're really struggling with that sort of sustain side of things. Keep in mind though that extra life on hit from weapons is still actually a fairly valuable stat. Once you're up to 50, 60, 70 life on hit, damn, you're going to have a lot of sustain, especially with those rapid fire weapons. Lastly, for the physical sort of side of things, I do think physical protect is pretty good. It's not the best thing in the world. Damage probably is a slightly higher priority until you get to the max difficulty, but I'm basically just theorizing now that I think there will come a point when the assassins, during that end phase of the Warzone, once you're taking like 300, 400% extra damage, which we're looking at like plus 500 power rating or so, you're probably going to die before you can kill anything, unless you get a very, very sweet balance between mitigation and sustain. And obviously you're going to need that damage to keep the sustain coming. For the assassin, dealing damage is going to be how you get your healing. So you may even find you need to swap over those digital weapons at that point, get yourself something that's going to reflect and mitigate a little bit of damage, and maybe be prepared to spec into a little bit of physical resist and combine that with some maybe even physical resistance on your gear too, to get that damage coming in, going down. Obviously the psychers are still going to hurt, the heat's still going to hurt, but the majority of weapons within this game dealing damage to you will be physical, and you can generally do a good job of avoiding them if you're using a high mobility build. So guys, that's my general thoughts on what's going to be strong within this. Obviously the Psyker's still going to have Molten Beam, which is completely ridiculously OP. Just use Molten Beam. There you go guys, there's a Psyker build for you right there. Use Molten Beam, job done. No, but seriously, put vulnerability on it and put something like armor piercing, armor penetration, and increase its effectiveness, and that's pretty much your build. Combine it with some buffs where you're not going to die so easily, and honestly that is just completely broken. Obviously you can have the odd AoE too, just to make your clearing times a little bit easier, but right now that really is the Psyker's thing, until they hopefully nerf that ability, because it's absolutely ridiculous. Ranged wise, I am expecting to have a slightly tougher time in the beginning of the game, but I'm wondering toward the end of the Warzone, maybe when the difficulty comes up a little bit, maybe we might even see those ranged players overtaking the melee, because the risk of jumping in with a melee character is just going to be tremendous. So guys, I'm really curious what you're going to be rocking for the Warzone down below. As soon as it's out, we'll be covering it with a live stream, we'll be covering it with footage. Should be fun to play, should be fun to watch. Really looking forward to giving it a bash. Guys, hope you're having a great week. Going to be doing some Gladius videos too over the weekend. Have yourself a nice week, and good luck to England in the footy on Saturday. Ta-ra.